first. Right. So, first question. If we adapt the equipment size to the body size, what's that called?
Can you repeat that one time?
Yes. If we adapt the equipment size to the body size, what is that called? Adapting, when we adapt the equipment, bless you, to the body size is called what? Question 2. How many components are there in the developmental sequence for catching? How many components is the validated developmental sequence for catching? Question 1. When we adapt the equipment size to the body size, what do we call that? Question number 2. How many components are there in the developmental sequence for catching? Question number 3. Name 2 of the 6. So there was a list of 6. Name 2 of the constraints that are related to success when we're intercepting, i.e. catching. Doesn't have to be catching, but that's the main skill this chapter is talking about. So name 2 of the constraints that are related to success when we have to intercept in a skill. Okay, make sure you've got your name on the paper, swap off with your neighbour. Alright, so 1 point each out of 3, okay? First one, adapting equipment to the body size is called body scaling. Body scaling. There are 3 components in the developmental sequence for catching. So they've validated and they decided that it was going to be 3 main components in catching. Right? 2 of the constraints that are related to success when intercepting. So your options are size, speed, trajectory, color, complexity, or distance. Those are the 6. Name 2 of them. Size, speed, trajectory, color, complexity, or distance.
What about structural environment?
That's what I put.
Structural environment.
Alright, so total out of 3.
Everybody passing the Logan.
We're in bar.
Distance is environment, so there are elements of environment here, but the specific environment is to be. Okay. Alright, so just a reminder, this is the last chapter for the next exam. So start thinking, bless you, start thinking about looking at notes and getting ready for an exam next week.
Do you know what day it'll be next week?
I think it's Friday on the syllabus. I believe it's
Can you take
Friday.
it early? Is that possible?
You organize it with me.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so in chapter 5 then, in chapter 9, we're looking at manipulative skills. These would fit under if you were just looking at a textbook or if you're looking at your TGMD where we've only got 2 divisions, locomotor and object control, then manipulative skills go along with ballistic skills under object control. Alright? And I'm going to pass around some wrist weights for you to play with while we're looking at this, because this will give you an idea of what the brain is trying to learn when we're trying to learn manipulative skills. Alright, so we've got 1 pound weights and 4 pound weights. Just have a play as they come around to you with trying to pick something up on your desk, or reaching out for your water bottle, or reaching down and picking up something out of your bag. Alright, so just have a play so that you can feel how different does it feel when you add extra weight onto your arm when you're doing a skill that you typically do a lot. Right? You reach out for your pencil, you try to write, you pick up a water bottle. So just have a feel. How does that alter? What does it feel like when you suddenly add a lot of extra weight onto your arm? Okay? So, humans aren't the only mammal to have an opposable thumb. Great apes, old world monkeys also have an opposable thumb, but they're not able to turn the thumb so far that we see this really strong connection between the forefinger and the thumb. Right? They can move their thumb, but it's not such a strong movement that we get that really pincery type action. Okay? So that makes quite a big difference to what humans are able to manage. Other animals, even birds, use tools to manipulate things and to find food. But we are the only ones that have developed the range of manipulation skills that we have. Structurally then, size of my hand would make a difference to what I can or can't manipulate, or some decisions that I might make about manipulation. Strength in my hand and in my arm might make a difference. The length of my arm might make a difference to the movement pattern that you see when we're looking at manipulative. As adults, when we're reaching and grasping, so when I'm going to steal this water bottle, right? I don't have to reach out and then stop and then pick up the water bottle. As adults, we have a lot of experience and we're able to reach and grasp, and it looks like one movement, but it's actually 2 movements in sequence that we've put together. Right? And we just do it so much that our brains are very well trained at that movement. So initially then, there are 2 very, very separate skills that the brain has to learn. So the first part we'll look at is the actual grasp. What happens when I try to pick something up? What do we see occurring? Technically, grasping is called prehension, right? And there was a lot of research done on grasping back in the early 1900s, right? Because they felt it was an interesting way to look at what the brain was doing. So, early, a lady called Lois Halverson looked at young infants and grasping, and she came up with 10 developmental steps that she thought she saw on a regular basis for grafting. So a sequence of development, you should be getting used to that idea now, right? Everything we look at, we see a sequence of development. We don't go from point A to adulthood without anything in between. There are always these stages, these steps of what's occurring. And so she came up with 10 ideas, and what she saw in her mind was a transition from what she called a power grip to grips that were more precise, to precision grips. Now, when she ran her experiments, she gave these young babies a 1-inch red cube to pick up. So if you consider that situation, she also had them sitting in the same position, so their environment didn't change, they weren't allowed to move around, and they didn't get to pick up lots of different objects. All they got was this one little cube. Well, we talked a little bit about those developmental laws of direction, right? That we are developing from the head down, cephalocaudal, and we're developing from the midline out, proximo-distal. So an infant doesn't have very good control over their fingers and their wrists, right? And it's possible then that the task that she gave them was too advanced for the babies to achieve well, okay? A power grip is where they might have to use 2 hands to pick something up. They might try with 2 hands. We also see palm down and fingers scrunching across, right? And then we start to see coming in maybe from the side. It takes quite a while before we start to see them move the thumb around away from the fingers. So initially when they're picking things up, the thumb is working with the fingers rather than around the object. Right? And then it takes even longer before you start to see them picking anything up with their fingers rather than the palm of their hand. Right? The other thing which the research which you can look out for is, do I use my elbow? So am I able to pick something up with strength in my shoulder and my arm, or do I have to have some support in order to pick something up? So, in the 80s, when constraints theory started to become popular, researchers said, okay, well this was a really interesting piece of research, and it was very detailed. But what happens if we're looking at it from a constraints theory approach? Then maybe this task, this piece of equipment, this 1-inch cube, if we alter the 1-inch cube, perhaps we'll see something different happen with the babies, right? So what they looked at was, again, young infants through to toddlers, and also some of the research is looking at what do we see in adults. So if you guys are reaching and grasping, what do we see? And what they saw when they ran this research was that the object size in particular, but also somewhat the shape of the object, made a difference to the type of the grasp that we saw. Right? So initially here, people interpreted this very much along the lines of maturational theory. The babies don't use a precise grip because their nervous system hasn't developed well enough, right? And they weren't seeing precision grips until 9, 10, 11, 12 months, quite old. Right? The stuff that's more based in constraints theory was seeing a lot more precise type attempts at picking up objects way earlier. By 5 months, they were seeing something where the children were trying to use their fingertips, right? And by 9 months, they were able to change the shape of their hand accordingly to the thing that they were going to pick up. So now people started going, well, maybe it's nothing to do with the neuromuscular system. If we can do a more precise grasp at 4 or 5 months, then that would indicate that the neuromuscular system is developed enough. So it can't have been just the development of the nervous system. Maybe it's the interaction, it's this idea of the interaction between the child and the object and the environment, right? And they also noticed that the children started, as they got a bit older, they started to use vision a lot. So they would watch their hand as it was approaching the object. So in our textbook, what they took was the original 10 stages. They've used some of the more recent research and they've tried to come up with a developmental trend here that's based in Howson's. Because Howson's ideas and the transitions aren't wrong. That's what you see. It's just that you can see them at a much earlier age if you give a more appropriate object. So here, these would be considered power grips, right? See, the palm is in touch. And here we start to see a transition to a more precise grip, a precision grip, right? A pincer, forefinger and thumb, we see a pincer somewhere around 9 to 10 months, and that's a pretty big milestone because that's true opposition and it's very fine control. So it's a really good idea as the babies are going through the first year, right? Cheerios, raisins, great work, great practice for the brain to get to a pincer grip. So if you've got a friend with a baby or a family member with a baby and that baby is 3 or 4 months, give them a pile of Cheerios and see what you see, right? What you will see is Cheerios will go everywhere. If you go back a few months later and you give them the pile of the Cheerios, they're going to be a lot more precise, and somewhere around 9 to 10 months, they're going to actually be able to pick up 1 Cheerio in a pincer. Right? It's a big development as a human to be able to do that skill. Okay. So let's think about what we see as we get older, right? Because we grasp all the time as adults. So part of what we're going to see is coming in the reach is the fact that we as adults don't touch objects before we pick them up, generally. Right? We walk over, we pick it up, we keep going, we don't even think about it. But if we filmed you doing that, in order to pick something up, your hand has to be the right shape. So when you're on the playground, what shape is your hand when you pick up the ball to throw at the target? Right? What shape is your hand when you reach into the bucket to get out some jingle bells? What shape is your hand when you pick your phone up or when you pick your pencil up to write some notes? Right? What are you doing that your brain has learned to do? Because we don't do this when we're born. Right? So from a motor point of view, fine motor skills develop generally slower than gross motor skills. Our window of opportunity that we did way, way back at the beginning of the semester, our window of opportunity for fine motor skills doesn't close until around 9 or 10. Right? right? Our window of opportunity for our gross fundamental skills is closing around 5. So we get a lot longer to practice this. Right? But as adults, what do? So if I'm picking up a pen, right, I don't come to the pen with my fingers wide open. I have my fingers pretty narrow as I pick the pen up. Right? I don't get there and then change my hand to pick up the pen. What do I do to pick up a quarter? What do we do to pick up a bottle of water or a glass? Think about your constraints. What if it isn't a glass of water? What if it's a really hot cup of coffee? What do? If it's a glass of water, I might not even look at the glass of water as an adult. If it's a hot cup of coffee, do I walk past and just pick up the hot cup of coffee? Or do I pay a little bit more attention to what I'm doing with my hand when I pick up a hot cup of coffee? So if I change the constraint, I change the behavior for a couple of reasons. One, the consequences of knocking the cup of coffee over because I misreach are worse, right? If I stain Mum's brand new carpet, I am big doo-doo, so I better be careful. Right? 2, if it's hot, I don't want to burn my hand, so I want to make sure I get the handle, not the side of the cup. Right? So we see much different behaviors, even in adults, depending upon what we do with the constraints. Okay. So, as adults then, we configure, we shape our hand before our hand gets to the object. Right? Infants, particularly if they're younger than 8 months, tend to reach and touch and then shape their hand in an appropriate way for the object. So they have to understand what the object is before they want to make the shape to try to pick it up. Right? So infants are using what we call haptic perception. And we see a lot of behaviors in young children that involve haptic perception. Haptic perception is information that my brain can learn about an object without having to look at it. So, what information can I learn about an object without having to look at it? Size, right? What was the one you said earlier?
Texture.
Texture's a good one.
Weight.
Weight, that's a good one.
Would you say like type, like the type of ball or like the type of shape?
Shape,
Yeah.
right? Shape is a good one. Okay. We also can get hardness. So is it hard? Is it soft? Is it squishy? No, texture is it bumpy? Is it smooth? Is it shiny? Hardness is it soft? Is it squishy? Or is it solid? Does that make sense? Good question though.
Like,
Right? Temperature, we can learn without looking at it. Okay. So, early childhood people are very aware there are lots of different hand actions that babies and young children use, and different actions. So if I'm poking something, right, then I'm working out how hard it is. But if I'm running my hand over it, then I'm looking at textures. So we're not early childhood people, we don't need that much detail, but the brain learns characteristics of objects using different actions to learn about the object. Right? So what we see in young children then is they will reach out, they'll touch, and then they'll change the shape of their hand in order to pick something up. Once they understand what the object is, then the brain knows what shape to make the hand to pick it up. So, cognitive learning is occurring alongside the development of fine motor skills. It's another situation where we see a link between moving and cognition. If I'm not able to move, if I'm not able to test and poke and shake and touch and lift, then I can't learn these concepts. Okay. So, all right. As adults, you know all these concepts, right? You make judgments based upon visual information that you get. So you might walk over to a box. How are you going to pick up the box? Right? Sometimes we make the wrong judgment. Right? Sometimes we walk over and go, oh, that box looks heavy, it's quite large, I'm going to, no, whoa, right? Because it didn't weigh anything. And the visual information that I got from the box, the decision I made based on that information was incorrect, right? Other times we go over to pick something up, we're like, whoa, okay, 2 hands. Right? So we're very visually dominant as adult humans, and sometimes we make the wrong choice, right? Not necessarily consciously. Your brain will just go, okay, this is what I need to pick this up, and then it turns out that wasn't correct. Alright, so this concept of body scaling, right? What we see when we grasp is that the movement we make is often body scaled. So if I give an elderly person a large tennis racket that is heavy, they will use 2 hands to swing the racket. Anybody remember Chrissy Everett playing tennis?
No.
Anybody seen a bit of film of Chrissy Everett playing tennis? She was one of the first 2-handed backhands. And the reason she developed a 2-handed backhand was because her dad started teaching her tennis at 4 or 5, and he gave her a full-size racket, and she couldn't hit a backhand. So they developed a 2-handed backhand. It's now become a very common stroke. A 1-handed backhand is now unusual. Right? But it was initially because he started her playing at such a young age. So what we find is that the key to the grasp that we see is the relationship between the hand size relative to the object size. We're not sure how this works with infants. Infants seem to sometimes use this rule and other times not. So the research is a little equivocal when we look at infants. But when we look at children from the age of 3, 4, 5 through teenagers and adults, what we see is that the ratio of the hand size to the object stays consistent when we transition from wanting to use one hand to two hand. So for example, if I'm going to pick up this, okay, I'm not going to use one hand. I could, but I'm probably going to use two hands to pick this up and move it over here. Okay. I don't stop and think about it. My brain just makes that calculation and uses two hands. Well, that ratio is consistent, it's the same. So if I look at a 5-year-old, the ratio of the size of the object to the size of their hand is going to dictate whether their brain goes for the object with two hands or one hand. Right? So it's the ratio that's the key, not the size of the object on its own.
So the ratio to the hands.
Yes.
So what about if I know the weight is like 200 pounds or 100 pounds? How does that react?
That might make a difference. Like if I know you've got nothing in there, plus it's soft and squishy, so I can scrunch it in one hand and pick it up. But if I'm not sure about the object, then what we see is the transition from 1 to 2 depends on this ratio, and it doesn't matter whether I look at 5-year-olds or whether I look at 25-year-olds. The ratio is the same. Right? Now the hand of the 5-year-old's a lot smaller, so they're going to use two hands for an object that's smaller than an adult, but the relationship between the hand and the object is the key. So interacting constraints then, if we come back to our triangle idea, if I change the size of the object, that will be a task constraint. What movement pattern do I see emerge? Right? So at some point, if I keep making the object bigger, what I'm going to get is a two-handed action over a one-handed action. Right? So just keep going back to how do we use the triangle to explain what we're seeing. So the other part then is the reaching. And the reaching's very interesting because of the change in the weight of the arm and the strength of the muscles in the arm over the lifespan. Initially we're getting stronger, at the other end of the lifespan we're getting a little bit weaker. Right? Grasping is very stable. The grasp itself, once your brain has learned that idea of grasping and different shapes, I don't have to relearn that as I get older. Reaching, so the initial question is what we saw something that looked like reaching way back when the baby was first born. Right? We had that stereotypical arm shaking going on. Why do we change from something that's involuntary, random, to a purposeful, deliberate, voluntary reach? And when we learn to reach, what's going on in the brain?
Like a relationship between object and yourself. Like if I was to hit a baseball, you have to know how long it is from where you're at.
Yes, that does play a role. So the distance between you, do you have to move? Okay, what is the object? So what we thought perhaps was that I have to learn to visually understand the object and match what my hand is doing to the object. But the more research they did with infants, the more they found that that didn't seem to be true, especially with the young infants. They didn't look at their hand initially when they were reaching. It's not until they've had some experience with reaching that they start to actually make sure their hand is going in the right direction. So initially, what we think the brain is doing when it starts to voluntarily move the arm is learning to control the arm, right? So what did it feel like when you added an extra pound or 4 pounds to your arm? Did that change how you reach? Right, Miguel, put the phone away.
It's just your body getting used to the weight of itself for it to
Yeah.
action.
Absolutely. The brain has to learn to carry that arm, right? It's heavy. I'm getting stronger, but my arm is also growing. So every time I get strong enough to lift that arm up and move it, it grows a little bit.
Isn't that what you were saying about why the muscles can't keep up and do the growth spurt?
In teenagers, you
Okay.
see that.
Okay.
Yeah, during the growth spurt in teenagers. Here we're looking at initial learning to reach. So initially, what we think the brain is doing is, how do I pick this arm up? How do I move it this way, this way? What do I have to do? What muscles do I turn on? And then we start really trying to connect the reach and the grasp. Right? So putting that weight on your hand, imagine what that would be like if you were trying to crack an egg and whisk an egg. And you've got an extra 4 pounds on your arm. What would that change in the movements that you were doing to make your omelette? Okay?
You know it's impossible to break an egg, do you farm?
It's impossible to break an egg with what?
You farm?
Really?
Yeah, you can't break it, like, if you have an egg right here, it's impossible to break. Try it.
They are very strong.
Squeeze it, squeeze it.
If you squeeze it, it won't break, or you step on it.
This is the way it's shaped,
But if you change it on its side, it's not gonna happen.
it will not break.
Huh, I did not know that. I did not know that. So, by 7 months, we see very distinct decisions being made about how the arm moves, what shape the hand is going to be. Right? And when we look at adults, we see some really interesting results. So in this experiment, what they did was put some mirrors in. So here's the target that the individual was told to reach for. But they put some mirrors in and they blocked off the initial part of the movement. Right? So I couldn't see my hand until the other side of this line. What they find, well, it's very weird, this experiment. I've done this in lab. It is the weirdest feeling because you can see this thing and you reach for it and all you get is fresh air. And it's quite disturbing. You're like, okay. Because what we see is that in adults, actually what we do is we only watch our hand, we only pay attention to starting the movement. And then we look ahead. Right? Well, here I couldn't see my hand. And so by the time I could see my hand, it was too late to change the movement pattern. Right? And so we were grasping for the wrong thing. So it's really interesting that we set it off on the right course and then we make assumptions about where it's going and the fact that the object is still going to be there when we get there. So, 2 months, 8 weeks old, infants are moving voluntarily their arms, and we see bilateral extension and reaching. So it's much easier for my brain to make both arms do the same thing at the same time. It means I turn both sides of the brain on at the same time. Right? That's the simplest version. Then we start to see reaching with two hands, but when we get there, one hand kind of runs ahead and gets to the object first. And then during year one, infants get pretty good at alternating, and they'll have periods of time where the brain will experiment with just reaching with one hand, or it'll go back, possibly because the arms grew a little bit. It goes back to two hands, and then it'll try one hand again. By 8 months, takes until around 8 months before we can really disassociate and do something different with each hand at the same time. So it takes quite a lot of practice for me to get to the point where I can tell, my left brain can tell my right hand to do something, and my right brain can tell my left hand to do something. So if you're looking at toys for young children, those toys where the stickle bricks stick together and you have to pull them apart, or you've got the wooden box with the holes of different shapes and you've got little wooden blocks that fit in the holes. When you look at the age range on those kinds of toys, they start around 10, 11, 12 months, right? That's a year-old toy. You wouldn't give that toy to a 3-month-old because they can't do two. I can't hold on to one thing and pull with the other hand. That's two completely different actions with my arms. Early after my first birthday, so within the next couple of months, we start to use objects as tools. That's fun. We start banging things. Right? So wooden spoons. Don't have to buy expensive toys. Go to the thrift shop, get an old wooden spoon and an old saucepan. Bang, 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 bang. Right? I can do that now. I can use tools. I can start to stick things into holes quite accurately. By 18 months, we start to see some cooperation between the hands. So I might be able to hold on to a jar and try to turn the lid with the other hand. So we get cooperation. And by the end of year 2, we see complementary activities. So think about what you have to do to open your tube of toothpaste. So my hands are doing something different, but they're working together to achieve a goal. What do you do in your day-to-day life that involves complementary activities of both your hands? Brushing your teeth, tying shoelaces, putting clothes on, driving your car. What about if you break your wrist and you've only got one hand to work with and you're trying to open your can of baked beans, right? Or break your egg for your omelet. So how does the changing constraints change the motor pattern, the behavior that you would see? What if I don't have 2 arms? What if I only have one? Prosthetics would be nice, but they're expensive.
I get those free in Canada.
Oh. So we'll move to Canada. Or England, right?
Or Europe.
As we're learning, reaching and grasping, posture plays a big role. Right? So reaching improves. We see a big change in reaching and manipulation skills around 6 to 7 months, at the point when the baby can sit up on its own unsupported. Right? So before that, if we want to help them with reaching and grasping, we would have to help them sit up, or we need to put them in a high chair and give them things to reach and grasp where they're supported. Right? So we see a change in their strength and their ability to control posture, and at concomitant we see improved in reaching and grasping, because now I can control this. right? So I can practice the next skill. So we see reaching and grasping at an earlier age than 6 to 7 months, but the baby would have to be supported. So when we look at adults, as usual, we don't have enough information. Okay? But we do have some data that indicates that reaching and grasping are always important, right? Many jobs, many careers are based on being able to reach and grasp, right? Many of your daily activities, as you've already seen, are impacted if I can't reach and grasp, right? If I want to be independent as an elderly person, I've got to be able to reach and grasp. Otherwise, I can't be independent. So it's a very important skill. Grip strength, maintaining grip strength. That's why there's like 900 million different versions of hand strength toys now. Okay, I have power putty that I play with when I think about it in the morning. Right? So, because grip strength is really crucial to maintaining independence. So manual performance goes down from around the age of 50. Part of that is just because we're slowing up. Part of it is that we're getting weaker from the age of 50. So if we want to maintain performance, we've got to stay active. This particular piece of research was looking at 21 through 70-year-olds, so they had a big range of population in there. Right? The movement slowed down, so there's lots of different tests that they do for fine motor skills. It's not just grip strength, that's one of the tests, but they also have them do functional tests, so opening jam jars. They'll do finger tapping for fine motor control. So how fast can you tap fingers? I've never been able to go very quick. Right? Some people can go very, very fast. They've got very, very quick control of fine motor skills. Right? Some of us were always challenged. Right? But that's a test that they can do to see how your fine motor control is coming along. Right? Coordination, different coordination assessments that they use, and they see that scores on those coordination assessments go down. The next study was looking at people who were older than 78. Me, I'm going to be really great if I just made 78, okay? But
You're gonna do it, miss. Don't
if
worry.
that would be nice, right? Strength declines. So again, if we stay active, we can't prevent strength declining, right? You can't prevent it, but you can slow it down so that the impact on your independence is less. Okay? And on many of these tests, there's a time limit, and what they found was that if they eliminate the time limit, then people over 78 into their 80s can do the task, but it just takes way longer than the assessment really allows. Right? Well, that might impact how safe I can be in my house. If it takes me too long to turn something off. Or driving my car. How long does it take me to move the steering wheel in response to someone stepping off the curb? A little bit of loss in coordination in handwriting, but until you're quite old, you really have to be getting into your late 80s or your 90s. We don't see a loss in force production. So I can still see my handwriting, but it starts to get a little bit wiggly wobbly. When you're in your 90s, you actually start to have problems with force production, so now it becomes very faint and wobbly. But again, making it into your 90s is a pretty big deal. Accuracy tends to be well maintained if the task is practiced a lot. So if I'm driving, I don't make a lot of errors with accuracy. If I'm paying attention, which can be a whole other problem. Okay, so we'll pick up with
Rapid aim.
rapid aim